The screech of iron wheels against steel rails pierced the morning air as another supply train thundered toward the small Pennsylvania town that would soon become America's most famous battlefield. Colonel Herman Haupt stood on the platform at Baltimore, watching as car after car loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and rations disappeared into the distance. He knew that in the coming days, these ribbons of steel would determine the fate of the Union. It was late June, 1863, and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia under General Robert Edward Lee had invaded Pennsylvania. The Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by General George Gordon Meade, was racing northward to intercept them. But beyond the movements of armies lay a more fundamental struggle, a battle of logistics that would be fought not with muskets and cannons, but with locomotives and telegraph wires. The Pennsylvania Railroad, that mighty artery of commerce and communication, had emerged as the Union's secret weapon. Stretching from Philadelphia through Harrisburg and beyond, its network of tracks formed the backbone of Northern supply lines. Unlike the South's fragmented and worn-down rail system, the Union's railroads were robust, well-maintained, and operated with military precision under the United States Military Railroad Service. Colonel Haupt, a brilliant engineer who had transformed military logistics, understood what many generals did not. Modern warfare was as much about moving supplies as moving soldiers. His trains could carry in a single day what would take hundreds of wagons weeks to transport. More importantly, they could do so regardless of weather, terrain, or enemy cavalry raids that might intercept slower wagon trains. The town of Gettysburg itself sat at a curious junction of roads rather than rails. 7 major turnpikes converged on the small borough, making it a natural gathering point for armies. But it was the railroad connections to the east and south that would prove decisive. The Western Maryland Railway reached nearby Westminster, while the Northern Central Railway connected Baltimore to Harrisburg, passing through the strategic town of Hanover, just 15 miles from Gettysburg. As Lee's army moved deeper into Pennsylvania, Confederate cavalry under General James Ewell Brown Stuart had been given orders to disrupt Union supply lines. Stuart understood the importance of the railroads as well as anyone. His troopers had spent months perfecting the art of rail destruction, heating iron rails over bonfires made from wooden ties, then wrapping the softened metal around trees in what became known as Sherman's neckties, though the technique predated that general's use of it. But Stuart's cavalry was operating in unfamiliar territory, far from their Virginia bases. They lacked the local knowledge that had made their raids so effective in their home state. Pennsylvania's rail network was also more densely interconnected than Virginia's, with alternate routes available when main lines were severed. The morning of June 30, 1863, found advance elements of both armies converging on Gettysburg. Confederate General Henry Heth's division was approaching from the west, drawn by reports of a shoe factory in town. His men desperately needed footwear after their long march north. Union cavalry under General John Buford had arrived from the south, their horses lathered and tired from hard riding. Neither commander knew that their chance encounter would trigger the largest battle ever fought on American soil, but both understood that whoever controlled the railroads would control the flow of reinforcements, supplies, and ultimately, victory itself. As the sun set on that final day of June, telegraph operators along the Pennsylvania Railroad's lines tapped out urgent messages. The great chess game of supply and logistics had begun. The dawn of July 1, 1863, brought the crack of rifle fire echoing across the rolling hills northwest of Gettysburg. What had begun as a chance encounter between foraging Confederates and Union cavalry was rapidly escalating into a full-scale battle, and the railroads immediately felt the strain. In Baltimore, Colonel Haupt received an urgent telegram from General Meade's headquarters. The Army of the Potomac needed ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements, and they needed them fast. Haupt's response was swift and decisive. Within hours, a steady stream of trains was rolling north on the Northern Central Railway. There, cars packed with everything from rifle cartridges to surgical instruments. The challenge was getting these supplies from the railheads to the actual battlefield. The nearest station to Gettysburg was at Hanover, 15 miles to the east, but Confederate cavalry had been spotted between the two towns. Alternative routes through Westminster to the south added crucial hours to the journey, but offered greater security from enemy raids. General Stuart's cavalry, meanwhile, was discovering the difficulties of operating in enemy territory. His troopers had successfully cut telegraph lines and torn up several miles of track on the Northern Central Railway near Cockeysville. But Union repair crews were working with remarkable speed to restore service. According to historical accounts documented in the Baltimore Sun's coverage of the period, these repair crews could replace damaged rails and restore telegraph service in a matter of hours, rather than the days such work had taken earlier in the Confederate supply situation was far more precarious. General Lee's army was operating at the end of a supply line that stretched back through the Shenandoah Valley to Richmond. Unlike the Union forces, which could draw upon the industrial might of the North, Lee's men were dependent on what they could carry or forage from the Pennsylvania countryside. The Army of Northern Virginia's quartermaster, Major John Harmon, was performing miracles with limited resources, but he lacked the railroad infrastructure that gave the Union such an advantage. As the first day's fighting intensified, both armies rushed reinforcements toward Gettysburg. Union General Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps was marching north from Maryland, while Confederate General Richard Stoddert Ewell's Corps was approaching from the northeast. The difference was that Hancock's men had been transported by rail for much of their journey, arriving fresher and better supplied than their Confederate counterparts, who had marched the entire distance. The Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad had worked through the night to move Hancock's corps northward. Flat cars normally used for freight were pressed into service as troop transports, with soldiers sitting on ammunition boxes and supply crates. It was uncomfortable and dangerous. One derailment could have catastrophic consequences, but it was fast. By midday on July 1st, the battle lines were forming. Confederate forces had pushed Union defenders through the town of Gettysburg itself, but at a heavy cost. General John Reynolds, one of the Union's most capable corps commanders, had been killed in the morning fighting. His First Corps was retreating in some disorder, but reinforcements were arriving steadily. The key to the Union's resilience lay not just in the courage of individual soldiers, but in the logistical network that kept them supplied. While Confederate ammunition wagons struggled over mountain roads, Union supply trains were delivering fresh cartridges to depots within a few hours' march of the battlefield. While Confederate medical services made do with limited supplies, Union field hospitals were receiving fresh bandages, medicines, and surgical instruments via the railroad. Colonel Haupt understood that the battle was as much about maintaining supply lines as controlling battlefield positions. His trains ran on precise schedules, with backup locomotives standing ready in case of mechanical failure. Telegraph operators maintained constant communication between supply depots and field commanders, ensuring that critical needs were met with minimal delay. As night fell on July 1st, both armies were digging in for what promised to be an even bloodier second day. The Confederates held the town of Gettysburg, but the Union forces had established strong defensive positions on the high ground to the south. The railroad war would continue through the night, with trains carrying supplies and reinforcements, in a race against time and Confederate cavalry. The second day of July, 1863, dawned gray and humid, promising another scorching Pennsylvania summer day. In the railroad yards of Baltimore and Philadelphia, the work never stopped. Locomotives hissed and clanked as they pulled out with their precious cargo, while telegraph operators maintained constant communication with field commanders who were desperately calling for more ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements. General Meade's headquarters had established a direct telegraph line to Colonel Haupt's operations center in Baltimore. Every hour brought new requests: artillery shells for the batteries on Cemetery Ridge, medical supplies for the overwhelmed field hospitals, and rations for troops who had been fighting for 2 days with little food. The efficiency of this communication network stood in stark contrast to the Confederate system, which relied heavily on mounted couriers who could take hours to traverse the distance between units. The Union's logistical advantage was becoming increasingly apparent. While General Lee's army was consuming supplies faster than they could be replaced, the Federal forces were actually building up their stockpiles. Trains arriving at Westminster and Hanover were unloading faster than the supplies could be transported to the battlefield, creating vast dumps of ammunition and provisions just 15 miles from the fighting. General James Longstreet's Confederate First Corps was preparing for a massive assault on the Union left flank, but his artillery was running low on ammunition. The Confederate ordnance wagons that had followed the army north were nearly empty, and there was no railroad to bring fresh supplies. Longstreet's guns would have to make every shot count, while their Union counterparts could fire with relative abandon, knowing that fresh ammunition was only hours away. The medical situation presented an even starker contrast. Union field hospitals were being supplied with fresh bandages, chloroform, and surgical instruments via the railroad network. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the Army of the Potomac's medical director, had revolutionized battlefield medicine partly through his ability to rapidly transport supplies and evacuate wounded soldiers. Confederate medical services, under Dr. Lafayette Guild, were equally dedicated, but lacked the logistical support that made Union hospitals so effective. As Longstreet's assault began in the late afternoon, the sound of artillery fire could be heard at the railroad stations 15 miles away. Trainloads of fresh ammunition were immediately dispatched toward the battlefield, their locomotive engineers pushing their engines to maximum speed. The Western Maryland Railway station at Westminster became a scene of controlled chaos, as supplies were rapidly transferred from rail cars to wagon trains for the final push to Gettysburg. According to military historians whose work was later documented in Harper's Weekly, the Union forces fired approximately 4 times as many artillery rounds during the Battle of Gettysburg as their Confederate opponents. This disparity was not due to superior courage or skill, but to the simple fact that Union batteries could be resupplied while Confederate guns gradually fell silent as their ammunition was exhausted. The famous assault on Little Round Top, where Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's 20th Maine Regiment made its desperate stand, was possible partly because of the railroad network. Chamberlain's men had been transported by rail from Maine to Maryland, then marched to Gettysburg with full packs and ample ammunition. When they ran low on cartridges during the fighting, runners were sent back to brigade supply wagons that had been restocked that very morning with ammunition brought by train. Meanwhile, Confederate General John Bell Hood's division was fighting with whatever supplies they had carried into battle. When Hood himself was wounded during the assault, the Confederate attack began to lose momentum. The lack of fresh ammunition meant that supporting artillery fire gradually diminished, leaving the infantry to fight with reduced support. The railroad network also enabled rapid reinforcement of threatened positions. When Union General Daniel Sickles advanced his Third Corps to an exposed position near the Peach Orchard, creating a dangerous gap in the Federal line, reserves were quickly moved to fill the breach. These reserve units had been transported by rail from Washington and Baltimore, arriving at the battlefield much faster than would have been possible by marching alone. As the sun set on July 2nd, the Union forces had held their positions despite fierce Confederate assaults. The railroad network had provided not just the material means to resist these attacks, but the psychological confidence that came from knowing that help was always available. For the Army of Northern Virginia, isolated far from their base of supplies, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The morning of July 3, 1863, found General Lee facing a crucial decision. His army had fought magnificently for 2 days, but had failed to break the Union lines. His supply situation was deteriorating rapidly, and he knew that every hour of delay allowed the enemy to grow stronger through their railroad-supplied reinforcements. The time had come for a desperate gamble. Lee's plan was audacious in its simplicity. A massive artillery bombardment would soften the Union center on Cemetery Ridge, followed by a direct assault by 15,000 Confederate infantry. If successful, it would split the Union Army in two and potentially end the war. If it failed, the Army of Northern Virginia might be destroyed far from home, with no railroad to carry the survivors to safety. The Confederate artillery chief, Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, understood the logistical reality behind Lee's plan. His guns had been carefully hoarding ammunition for 2 days, but even so, he could sustain intensive fire for only a limited time. Once the bombardment began, there would be no opportunity to resupply his batteries. In contrast, the Union artillery under General Henry Jackson Hunt had been resupplied throughout the night by trains that had arrived at Westminster and Hanover. At railroad stations throughout Maryland and Pennsylvania, the morning brought frantic activity. Colonel Haupt had received word that a major Confederate assault was expected, and he responded by pushing every available locomotive toward the battlefield. Hospital trains were prepared to evacuate wounded soldiers, while ammunition trains stood ready to rush forward at a moment's notice. The contrast between the two armies' situations was stark. Union General Meade had established his headquarters in a small farmhouse with direct telegraph communication to Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. He could request reinforcements or supplies and receive them within hours. Lee, operating eyes in enemy territory, was dependent on mounted couriers and whatever intelligence his cavalry could gather. At 1 o'clock that afternoon, the Confederate bombardment began. 150 guns opened fire simultaneously, creating a roar that could be heard for miles. The effect was spectacular, but ultimately ineffective. Most of the Confederate shells overshot their targets, landing in the rear areas where supply wagons and reserve troops were positioned. The Union artillery, following General Hunt's orders, remained largely silent to conserve ammunition for the infantry assault that was sure to follow. The famous charge that followed, led by General George Edward Pickett's division along with units from General James Johnston Pettigrew's and General Isaac Ridgway Trimble's commands, was a magnificent display of courage that ended in tragic failure. The Confederate infantry advanced across nearly a mile of open ground, under devastating fire from Union artillery and infantry that had been well supplied with ammunition throughout the battle. As reported in contemporary accounts later compiled by the Pennsylvania Historical Society, the failure of Pickett's charge was due not just to the strength of the Union position, but to the fundamental logistical imbalance between the two armies. Union defenders had adequate ammunition, food, and medical supplies, while the attacking Confederates were operating at the end of an increasingly tenuous supply line. The aftermath of the failed assault was devastating for Lee's army. Thousands of casualties littered the battlefield, and the survivors were demoralized and exhausted. More critically, the Army of Northern Virginia was now dangerously low on ammunition and medical supplies, with no prospect of resupply. The railroad network that had sustained the Union forces throughout the battle was beyond Confederate reach. General Meade, meanwhile, was receiving telegraphic reports from his supply officers that fresh ammunition and reinforcements were arriving at the railroad stations. If he chose to launch a counterattack, he would have the logistical support to sustain it. The Confederate army, isolated and weakened, would be vulnerable to destruction. Yet Meade hesitated. His own army had suffered heavy casualties, and he was uncertain of Lee's remaining strength. The decision to pursue would prove controversial, but it reflected the cautious approach that had characterized Union generalship throughout much of the war. The railroad had given the Union the means to victory, but not necessarily the will to exploit it. As night fell on July 3rd, both armies faced an uncertain future. The Confederates were trapped in enemy territory with dwindling supplies, while the Union forces had the logistical means to either pursue their advantage or allow their enemies to escape. The Railroad War was far from over. The morning of July 4th, 1863, brought a somber Independence Day to the blood-soaked fields around Gettysburg. General Lee's army was broken, but not destroyed, and the Confederate commander faced the most difficult decision of his military career. With his supply lines stretched to the breaking point and his army deep in enemy territory, retreat was the only option. But retreat across the Potomac River with a pursuing enemy would require every ounce of his military skill. The logistical challenge facing Lee was immense. His army had lost nearly a third of its strength in 3 days of fighting, and thousands of wounded men would have to be transported across hostile territory. The Confederate wagon trains stretched for miles, moving slowly over mountain roads that became quagmires in the summer rain. Every mile of retreat took them further from their supply bases in Virginia and closer to potential disaster. General Meade, meanwhile, was receiving urgent telegrams from Washington demanding immediate pursuit. President Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin McMaster Stanton understood that this might be the Union's best opportunity to destroy Lee's army and end the war. The railroad network that had sustained the Union forces throughout the battle could now support a vigorous pursuit. But Meade remained cautious. Colonel Haupt was already adapting his supply network for a potential pursuit. Trains loaded with ammunition, rations and medical supplies were being positioned at strategic points along the Pennsylvania and Maryland railroads. If Meade decided to follow Lee's retreating army, the logistical support would be available within hours. The efficiency of this system stood in stark contrast to the Confederate Army's increasingly desperate situation. The retreat began during the night of July 4th, with Lee's wounded leading the way in a wagon train that stretched for 17 miles. The Army of Northern Virginia's remaining cavalry, under General Stuart, provided screening and rearguard actions, but they were exhausted and outnumbered. Union cavalry under General Alfred Pleasonton was in pursuit, supported by fresh supplies delivered by railroad to stations throughout Maryland. The Confederate medical crisis was becoming acute. Dr. Guild's Medical Corps was performing miracles, with limited supplies, but they lacked the medicines, bandages, and surgical instruments that the railroad had provided to their Union counterparts. Hundreds of wounded Confederate soldiers were being left behind in impromptu hospitals, where they would become prisoners of war, but would also receive better medical care than their army could provide. Weather became Lee's unlikely ally. Rains turned the roads to mud, slowing both armies but favoring the defender. The Union pursuit was hampered by the same conditions that made the Confederate retreat so difficult. However, the railroad continued to function despite the weather, delivering supplies to Union forces, while the Confederates struggled with their vulnerable wagon trains. At Williamsport, Maryland, Lee's army reached the Potomac River, only to find it swollen by rain and impassable. The pontoon bridge that had carried the army north had been destroyed by Union cavalry, and the Confederates were trapped on the north bank of the river. This was potentially the disaster that Lincoln had hoped for. Lee's army was cornered with its back to the river and limited supplies. Colonel Haupt received orders to concentrate all available rolling stock for a massive supply effort. If Meade attacked the trapped Confederate army, the Union forces would need enormous quantities of ammunition and supplies. According to military records later preserved in the National Archives, more than 50 trainloads of supplies were positioned within a day's march of Williamsport, creating the largest logistical concentration of the war. The siege of Williamsport lasted for over a week, with both armies entrenched and facing each other across rain-soaked fields. The Union forces were well supplied through their railroad network, while the Confederates were reduced to quarter rations and were rapidly consuming their remaining ammunition. Lee's engineers worked frantically to construct a new bridge across the Potomac, knowing that escape was the only alternative to destruction. The contrast between the two armies' situations was stark. Union soldiers received fresh rations daily via the railroad, while Confederate troops foraged for food in the countryside. Union hospitals were supplied with the latest medicines and surgical instruments, while Confederate medical services made do with whatever they could find. The railroad had created a fundamental imbalance that grew more pronounced with each passing day. On July 13th, Lee's engineers completed their bridge, and the Army of Northern Virginia began its escape across the Potomac. The retreat was conducted with remarkable skill, but it marked the end of the Confederacy's last major offensive. The failure at Gettysburg, combined with the fall of Vicksburg on July 4th, had turned the tide of the war decisively in favor of the Union. The railroad had played a crucial role in this transformation, providing the logistical foundation that enabled Union victory. The sun rose on July 14, 1863, over empty Confederate trenches at Williamsport. General Lee's army had escaped across the Potomac during the night, but they left behind a transformed strategic situation. The Army of Northern Virginia would never again possess the strength to launch a major offensive, and the railroad network that had sustained Union forces at Gettysburg would continue to strangle Confederate hopes for independence. Colonel Haupt stood in the Baltimore headquarters of the United States Military Railroad, reviewing the statistics of the past 2 weeks. His trains had delivered over 2 million pounds of supplies to the battlefield, transported thousands of reinforcements, and evacuated nearly 15,000 wounded soldiers. The efficiency of the railroad network had proven itself under the ultimate test of combat, establishing logistics as a decisive factor in modern warfare. The strategic implications of Gettysburg extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The Union's ability to rapidly concentrate forces and supplies via railroad had fundamentally altered the nature of military campaigning. No longer could armies operate independently of their supply lines for extended periods. The side with superior logistics would possess an increasingly decisive advantage as the war progressed. General Meade's failure to pursue and destroy Lee's retreating army would remain controversial, but it reflected a deeper truth about Union strategy. The railroad network had given the North the means to wage a war of attrition that would inevitably favor the side with superior industrial capacity. The Confederacy's agricultural economy, dependent on slave labor and lacking extensive railroad networks, could not compete with Northern industrial might over the long term. The Confederate railroad system, already strained by the demands of war, would deteriorate rapidly after Gettysburg. Union cavalry raids, coordinated with the main armies through telegraph communication, would systematically destroy Southern rail lines. General William Tecumseh Sherman's later march through Georgia would target railroads specifically, recognizing their importance to Confederate resistance. The medical revolution pioneered during the Gettysburg campaign would have lasting effects. The ability to rapidly evacuate wounded soldiers via railroad, combined with improved battlefield medicine, dramatically reduced mortality rates. Union soldiers knew that if they were wounded, they would receive prompt medical attention and rapid transportation to well-equipped hospitals. This knowledge improved morale and fighting effectiveness throughout the Federal armies. The economic impact was equally significant. The Pennsylvania Railroad and other northern lines had demonstrated their ability to support large-scale military operations while maintaining civilian commerce. This dual capability would prove crucial as the war entered its final phase. The Confederate economy, by contrast, was increasingly disrupted by the destruction of its limited railroad network. As documented in post-war analyses by military historians, the Battle of Gettysburg marked a turning point, not just in military tactics, but in the fundamental nature of warfare itself. The conflict had evolved from a gentleman's war fought according to 18th-century rules into a modern industrial struggle where logistics mattered as much as battlefield courage. The lessons learned at Gettysburg would influence military thinking for generations. The importance of railroad networks in supporting modern armies would be recognized by military planners worldwide. The American Civil War had demonstrated that wars between industrial nations would be won or lost as much in the factories and railroad yards as on the battlefields. Colonel Haupt's achievement in creating an efficient military railroad system would serve as a model for future conflicts. His innovations in supply chain management, combined with the telegraph network that coordinated train movements, had created the world's first truly modern military logistics system. The iron rails that carried supplies to Gettysburg had helped forge the chains that would bind the Union together. In the end, the Battle of Gettysburg was won not just by the courage of Union soldiers or the tactical decisions of their commanders, but by the railroad network that made their victory possible. The Confederacy's defeat had been written in iron and steam, determined by the fundamental economic and technological advantages that the Union had possessed from the war's beginning. The railroad had proven itself to be the most decisive weapon in the Union arsenal, more powerful than any cannon or rifle in determining the war's ultimate outcome. The transformation was complete. The age of railroad warfare had begun, and with it, the modern era of industrial conflict where victory would belong to the side that could best mobilize its economic and technological resources.